Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Judge Gerald Rosen. He is the recently retired Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court in Michigan, and he was the chief mediator in one of the biggest and most important bankruptcies in American history, the bankruptcy of the great city of Detroit. This is an incredible story, one with so many fascinating twists and turns, and it really is a cautionary tale, as you'll hear, for all American cities facing the fiscal challenges that our cities face, from Philadelphia to California and all the cities along the West Coast and everyone in the middle too. The dangers that cities face with all the demographic, economic and social changes that have come about in the last 30, 40 years. Detroit was the first great, large American city to file for bankruptcy, but it may not be the last. And so Judge Rosen offers a lot of fascinating stories about what happened, how the issue got resolved, and how this also is a story about people from all different backgrounds, economic positions, political persuasions, coming together to resolve a great and important issue. Fascinating episode. Stay tuned. My guest today on Good Law, Bad Law is Judge Gerald Rosen. Judge Rosen is the former chief judge of the federal court, the court in Detroit, Michigan. And we're going to be talking today about a fascinating story of a city in financial trouble and its recovery, and Judge Rosen's very central role, along with some other people as well, in the resolving of this financial crisis, the Detroit bankruptcy. So first of all, Judge Rosen, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
I've been reading about this as we've been getting ready for this episode, and what an incredible story. And as we'll hear, Judge, a story that really has not only some great lessons in it about how people in a city come together to resolve a really dire situation, and one facing a lot of cities around the country today. But as you point out, I know you're going to tell us about this, a city of people really coming together from all different backgrounds to save a great city of this country. So I thought maybe we could start by just having you give us a little bit of background on yourself, how you came to the court, and how you then came to play a central role as the lead mediator in this great bankruptcy crisis.
Well,
that's a big intro, I know.
That is. How long do we have, Aaron? So I grew up in the Detroit area, lived here most of my life, other than 6 years in Washington, D.C., getting a law degree and working on the Hill. And came back, practiced law for about 11 years at a large firm here in Detroit. Had some unsuccessful political forays, which on reflection were very successful in the end for me. Because
you might have been spared.
Because I lost.
Right.
And in 1990, I was nominated to the federal court here by President Bush 41.
Right.
And
Bush the first.
On the court for 27 years until last year, when I retired, and am now with JAMS, which is the world's largest mediation and arbitration service in the world. So that's in as much as I can encapsulate what's been a great ride.
Right. And that's a big court. That's the federal court in Detroit. And starting in the 2012, 2013 time period, Detroit goes from bad to really worse in terms of the city's economy, right? And faces being on the edge of bankruptcy and ultimately having to file for bankruptcy. Can you give us a little bit of the overview as to what was going on in the city at that time? Because again, I think there are lessons in what Detroit faced then for other great cities in the country.
Sure, I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. So it is, Detroit in the 50s was one of the world's great cities. It was the fourth largest city in the country. It was robustly well off vis-a-vis other cities. It had very stable government, very stable workforce. The auto companies, what we used to call the big three, GM, Chrysler, and Ford, were clicking along. People were coming from all over the world to work in Michigan, and particularly the Detroit area, in the plants, and making good lives for themselves. It was the ultimate middle class dream,
Right.
and doing very, very well. And lots of different demographic issues happened. Certainly, the growth of the suburbs, as in many cities, began to take root. Racial issues in 1967, July of 1967, we had probably the worst race riot in the country and in our nation's history. And we had a series of ineffective mayors and polarizing mayors that accelerated both business and residential flight from the city. And things began to spiral. And as is so often the case when these sorts of things happened, the spiraling was exponential. The residential and business tax base was declining. Population was declining precipitously. In the mid-50s, Detroit had almost 2 million people. And by the filing of the bankruptcy in 2013, Detroit was under 700,000 people. So with the decline of the population, the revenue base was disappearing. With the disappearance of the revenue base, Detroit was stacking debt upon debt, and Detroit was becoming what bankruptcy experts often refer to as service delivery insolvent, which basically means that a city is really not a city anymore. It cannot provide the most basic services to its citizenry. In Detroit, for example, the average run time for 911 calls was running close to an hour. Many fire calls were not being answered at all. EMS calls were running 25 minutes at points, and snow wasn't being picked up. Trash wasn't being picked up. 40% of the city's 90,000 lights were out, and
God.
Copper innards that would be needed to repair them had been scrapped by scavengers, so they couldn't be repaired. Detroit's bond rating was at junk status and falling, so it couldn't, even if it wanted to, it couldn't borrow. But it couldn't borrow really because back in 2005 it had already hit its statutory borrowing limit and had done a very risky borrowing at the time, probably illegal, to circumvent the statutory borrowing limit to shore up its then failing pensions, municipal pensions, which at that point were already $1.5 billion underwater. So they borrowed $1.5 billion. Yes, I'm sorry.
Explain that part, Judge, because that's something that I think for many cities, large cities and medium-sized and small cities, that factor right there, the pension issue, that's a real problem that not only Detroit had, but many cities have, and dealing with all of these other factors coming together, declining jobs, people moving out of the suburbs, so all the revenue cities enjoyed is going down, and then they're stuck with these burdens. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I think that seems pretty crucial.
Well, you're absolutely right, Aaron. This problem was not unique to Detroit. Many cities are facing it. Most, if not all, are in absolute denial. And, denial is a river in Egypt. It's not a path to resurrection.
Right.
It,
That's right.
it's not a path to solving problems. I mean, just one example that I think many people are familiar with is Chicago. The municipal debt in pension debt in Chicago conservatively is estimated at north of $30 billion. It's probably, for reasons we can get into, but are fairly technical, involving discount rates and those sorts of things, it's probably more like $50 million. Atlantic City, Philadelphia, you can go on. California, of course, is in the, it's between its CalPERS pension debt and the municipal debt is well north of $1 trillion in debt. And as I often say to people, you know, Hollywood continues to make these fantastical movies about climate change and tsunamis washing over cities. The real tsunami that's washing over cities is municipal debt. And you know, you can't make very exciting movies about it. Although The Big Short did a pretty good job of capturing.
Yeah, it was. Well, and that of course becomes maybe I don't know if you agree, but maybe the last big generator of the tsunami wave that takes over, because of course you have the Wall Street crisis of 2008, 2009, and those big three automakers that fueled the renaissance and growth of Detroit are themselves facing insolvency.
Yep.
But for the rescue of the car companies, of the automakers, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, and that was certainly a major factor in 2008, 2009 on Detroit's problems. It was just one of any number of accelerators. Detroit also had very serious corruption problems, as you may have read about. Our former mayor, Kilpatrick, is now a guest of the federal government Bureau of Prisons for 28 years, and 42 of his associates were indicted and convicted of various types of Ponzi schemes, fraud, RICO charges.
I do remember reading about that. In fact, there was a book that came out a couple of years ago about Detroit, kind of the history of the city and up through the present times.
So it was very much pay to play in Detroit, and you know, businesses didn't that and weren't investing. And one of the great stories of Detroit's incredible recovery, I don't know how much you're following it, but Detroit's now the hottest investment city in the country, one of the hottest in the world. But what does not get a lot of attention is the fact that in addition to having successfully moved through the bankruptcy and having one of the cleanest bottom lines of any city in the country, it also has one of the cleanest governments now. The culture of corruption that prevailed for so many years in Detroit was cleaned up, and businesses are coming in. They don't have to pay an entry fee, to come in and play. And businesses from all over the world are coming into Detroit now. And the fact, the fact real estate is much less expensive than in other major cities is certainly a part of it.
Well, take us to the moment then, which is the lead into your getting involved in this, which is the actual filing or attempting to file for bankruptcy, and then finally filing for bankruptcy. I know, unfortunately, a lot of people understand the idea of having debts greater than assets or greater than income. And unfortunately, many people as individuals and as businesses end up filing for bankruptcy. But the idea of a city actually filing for bankruptcy in our country's history is not a very frequently occurring event. And Detroit is the largest city that ever had to reach that point. So give us, if you would, that background just a little bit, because that's the lead into how you get involved. And then we're going to have to talk about Winston Churchill.
So, Detroit was sliding toward oblivion, as I said, gradually and then exponentially for decades. And all of the governors and all of the mayors were kicking the can down the road and sweeping the problems, the underlying debt structure problems, the underlying financial problems the underlying service insolvency problems. They were just sweeping it under the rug, and nothing was being addressed. Rick Snyder became governor in 2010, and he made Detroit his priority. And he is, by background, he is both a business guy, a venture capitalist, used to doing turnarounds, but also a CPA. So these kinds of financial dysfunction issues really excite him. And he appointed a team. He did a very deep dive, not only into Detroit's financial dysfunction, but also into its more complex demographic and service delivery problems. And he appointed an emergency manager, Kevin Orr from the Jones Day law firm, to come in under the state statute, and basically he was sort of a municipal dictator. He had complete authority to run the city and to pay down debt. And he tried to do it through negotiations for several months. He made he published and gave to all of the city's creditors what was called a proposal for creditors, which was much more, really. It was a deep dissection of Detroit's financial and service delivery status. But Kevin could not come to any agreements with any of the stakeholders, not the unions, not the pensioners. Detroit was by this time $3.5 billion. Its pensions, both the civilian pensions and the uniform pensions, were very, very optimistically stated $3.5 billion underwater. It was probably more like $5 or $6 billion underwater. And Kevin, for months, tried to negotiate, and it wasn't working. And Detroit was continuing to circle the drain. People were continuing to leave. Businesses were continuing to leave. Bankruptcy was clearly on the horizon. And the governor authorized the filing of the bankruptcy on July 18th, 2013. You may have read about some of the problems they had filing. There was a race to the courthouse because the pensioners and the unions were trying to enjoin the governor from filing. They got to the courthouse at about 4 o'clock. The state had tried to file its bankruptcy petition, which was massive, and it it crashed our court's electronic filing system. I got a panic call from our court administrator saying the city's trying to file, and our PACER system our electronic filing ECF has crashed. And so the judge was beginning the proceeding up in Lansing in state court, and she was clearly headed toward enjoining the governor from filing. When they finally got it filed at 4:06 p.m., and her clerk walked out and told her there was an automatic stay, so that was the end of that lawsuit. Lots more happened.
So in other words, finally, when the federal bankruptcy gets filed, that puts a stop to all the other state court lawsuits that were trying to be filed.
Under the bankruptcy code, every lawsuit, state, federal, every lawsuit is immediately stayed. And so the race to the courthouse ended with the filing of the bankruptcy. And we had seen it coming, of course. I say we, those of us in the court. It was obvious that it was going to come, and negotiations had broken down. So as chief judge, I was getting ready. This is a huge case. You have issues of security. You have issues of just physical capacity to handle a case like this. You have media issues. So as chief judge, all of that fell on my plate, and I had been meeting with the chief judge of the bankruptcy court, making arrangements for use of our physical facility, because their bankruptcy court would not have been able to handle it. So we were doing that. I was meeting with the marshal, and then Judge Shefferly, who was the chief judge, came over, asked if he could see me, and told me that under the under Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code, which is the Municipal Bankruptcy Code, the Chief Judge of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals appoints the bankruptcy judge, which I didn't know. I thought it was random selection like everything else. And he asked me if I had a candidate to talk to the chief judge about if she called me. And, this came out of left field, so I hadn't really thought about it. But there was one person who I knew well. He was a former chief judge of the bankruptcy court. I knew him very well. And we had many talented bankruptcy judges, but Steve Rhodes was, in my estimation, the best. I should have mentioned, Steve came over with Phil. And so when he asked me if I had a thought about who I might recommend if Chief Batchelder called me, I certainly had a thought, but it was a delicate question, right?
Yeah. Do you want somebody qualified and capable, but you also have to, know that you are giving somebody a responsibility that they might resent you for in the future.
Yeah, and there was one other complication. Steve was planning to retire at the end of the year, and at that point, I think all of us thought that the bankruptcy would go on for years, not months. We had another meeting about it. I had done what a good chief judge should do, which is pull the bench. You don't want to get on an issue like this, you don't want to get too far out in front of your court. And pretty much everybody thought that Steve was the one. But he had to promise me he was going to serve for the duration, no matter how long it was. He couldn't just bail out halfway.
Pun intended, Judge. He couldn't bail out right away.
This might have been the first deal of the bankruptcy, actually. Steve and I and Phil, the chief judge of the bankruptcy court, had what the diplomats call a full, frank, and candid conversation. I told Steve if Judge Batchelder called me, I wanted to be able to recommend him, but I couldn't recommend him if he was still planning on retiring at the end of the year. I needed a commitment from him that he'd be in for the duration. And he looked at me and he said, I know that. And I've talked with my wife about it, but I have a thought about that. And I said, okay. He said, how about if you serve as the chief mediator? That didn't come out of left field. That came out of outer space.
Right. You were asking him to step up. I mean, he had to postpone his retirement, not just to handle a bankruptcy, but to handle a historic bankruptcy, to handle a complicated matter where the future of the city is hanging in the balance. And then he turns around and he asks you to make a sacrifice too to get involved in this. But as I understand the history,
I didn't know what to say, Aaron. Yeah. I the first thing I said something like, Steve, I think you just want some company in the bullseye.
Yeah.
He laughed and I laughed, but that was what I thought. That was my immediate reaction, because we all knew this was going to be a highly contentious, deeply controversial. We were already having demonstrations, very angry demonstrations every morning at our courthouse, and so when I said that, I was only half joking, but and then I thought about it. I mean, I'm a Detroiter. I love my city, and I thought that this maybe was an opportunity to make a contribution, but I knew there were problems. I began talking to some of my colleagues, not all of whom were enthusiastic about the idea of their chief judge jumping into the middle of something like this. As one of my colleagues said, not wrongly, one of my colleagues said, this is going to be very, very difficult, highly contentious. It may very well not end well, and you're going to be bringing our court into this as chief judge. Mm-hmm. So I understood that, and there were also issues because appeals from the bankruptcy court come into our court, so my colleagues would be in the position of deciding whether deals that I had put together should be approved. Because certainly if you deal with one creditor, other creditors might well and did oppose it. So there were lots of issues, and I was, quite honestly, I was very torn. My wife didn't want me to do it. I was very busy being, with just a judge. I had a full docket and the administrative responsibilities of being chief judge. I was teaching, I was writing, and, she was already not happy as well. And so I was getting a lot of pushback, and it was a hard decision. And the more I got pushback, the harder the decision was. So there was one.
Yes, I know your 15-year-old son at the time had a big part in helping you make the decision that you would get involved and be the chief mediator in this. How did that? You have to tell that story because it's a good one.
Yeah, so we were driving out to play golf on a Saturday morning. I know it sounds like all I do is play golf. I'm a terrible golfer, and I had just really recently, after a lifetime of disdaining it, taken it up. But Jake was a very good golfer, and we were driving out to play golf, and Steve Rhodes called, and he needed a decision about whether I was going to do this, and I told him I was getting pushback from my colleagues. There were serious issues, and Steve said, okay, I understand that, but you got to make a decision here. So I told him I would make the decision over the weekend, call him first thing Monday. So Jake didn't say anything. He was listening to the conversation on Bluetooth, and when we were driving back, all of a sudden he just looks at me and he says, so Dad, are you really thinking about not doing this bankruptcy thing? And I said, well, Jake, you heard this is a very difficult thing. Not all of my colleagues think it's a great idea. I have to think about the court first. And he looks at me just intently. And I've been a Churchill guy, Winston Churchill guy, ever since college, and talk about Churchill's heroism and courage. And he looks at me and he says, what do you think Churchill would have done, Dad? Do you think Churchill would have refused? Everybody has a time to stand up. This is your time. And, it's like a 2x4, just between the eyes, And it just crystallized. Yeah. I had no idea how it would turn out, but it just crystallized.
It gives you chills to think of that 15-year-old understood that this was a moment. This was a moment to step up, and obviously you did. We know that, and you had to then take all these different stakeholders, interests, Wall Street banks, the unions, other creditors. There were, tens and tens of thousands of creditors owed money. The Detroit Institute of Art, world-class art museum that's sitting on billions of dollars worth of paintings. This is such a huge story, and I know we can't get into all of it, and it's a big ask to say, tell us what happened and how did you do this, but picking up on the point that we talked about in the beginning about this is a moment where it's more than just a bankruptcy. It's really people having to come together to everybody sacrifice in the interest of saving the city. How did you? Tell us a little bit about that and what was the role you played in that? How did you?
Yeah. So again, another golf story here, sorta. Jake and I had a long planned golf vacation down to Florida. Right after I was appointed chief mediator, and I had our court librarian put together a lot of reading for me. And I took it down with me. I was getting up very early in the morning reading about the history of Detroit's debt, its service insolvency, and trying to get my hands around it. And I was talking to all of the lawyers as well. And it quickly became apparent that Detroit had no assets other than the art collection at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which was one of the great art collections in the world that had been gifted to the city by its founding fathers and its its philanthropists in the early part of the 20th century. 66,000 pieces, all of the major masters, the Diego Rivera murals, and it was the only asset the city had. And all of the creditors, it became very clear, all of the creditors wanted it. Every conversation I had with the creditors, and with, for that matter, with Kevin Orr and his lawyers, ended with the same. They were all great conversations, very positive, but they all ended with the same question: what about the art? And at the same time, there was an ugly narrative beginning to develop that had a racial undertone to it, and it was very, very ugly, which was that the art was sort of the preserve of the cultural elite suburbs, and the pensioners, who were largely African American, had nothing, and their pensions. Kevin Orr, the emergency manager, was threatening to cut municipal pensions by 40 to 50%, and these pensions were not plush. The average civilian pension was about $19,000 a year. The average uniform pension for the police and firefighter retirees was $32,000, but they didn't get Social Security, so it would have devastated these folks. So there was this narrative that was developing, sort of pensions versus art. Why not just liquidate the museum?
Right. So on the one hand, save a $50 million Van Gogh painting at the expense of, African American retired city workers, cops, firefighters.
And not just the retirees, the financial creditors wanted to liquidate the art.
Yeah.
So as I began to read and talk to the lawyers, I began to think about the bankruptcy as really bookended by the art and the pensions. And I was still down in Florida at a friend's condo, and I got up very early one morning, and this had just been, really percolating in my mind, and it had become clear that I had to find some way to monetize the art, but I did not want to liquidate it. And in my mind, liquidating this museum and its collection would have been the exclamation point on Detroit's obituary. And in addition to that, Aaron, for what? Detroit had been cannibalizing its heritage to mortgage its future for decades. And where had it gotten us? This was just going to be another one. And beyond that, the Detroit Institute of Arts was in Midtown and anchored Midtown, really. It was the one area of the city that was kind of beginning to percolate and thrive and nascently grow. And I went on this website just for the heck of it, and I saw that the museum was bringing in 550,000 people a year to Detroit. And I thought, you liquidate this museum, it's going to be like a hydrogen bomb in the middle of the city. So it was, there was that reason, and there was a political side to it too. The museum was already, they weren't going to just go quietly. They were already building a litigation fund. They had hired two very large law firms, one from New York, one from Detroit. They believed that the art could not be impaired or liquidated in the bankruptcy. There were lots of good legal arguments about that. So it would have been a war. And, the museum's board was sort of a who's who in Detroit, and indeed all over the state. And it would have pitted those folks against, the pensioners and all of the city's unions and creditors. It would have been a civil war almost. And like any litigation, Judge, we know this as litigators and judges. It's not just war; it's an expensive war, and the lawyers, in those battles end up doing very well. And so, if there's a way to cut through all these varying interests and these conflicts and find a way, we're really talking about how mediation and resolution can
avoid, not only solve a problem, but avoid all kinds of very expensive problems that you'd otherwise have to deal with.
No, you're so right, Aaron. I mean, the lawyers, there would have been nothing left of Detroit but dust. With 5 years or 7 years of bankruptcy, businesses continuing to leave, residents continuing to leave, services continuing to dissolve in the city, there would have been nothing left of Detroit but dust. I felt a real urgency, and I know Judge Rhodes felt a real urgency in trying to get Detroit to the other side, and the only way to do that expeditiously was through consensual agreements by the creditors with the city. And the only way to do that was in the context of our mediation. And I'll never forget, when I was reading the background, I was reading about the city's assets. There were no assets. And I remember sitting there down in this little condo in Florida thinking, this is great. My legacy is going to be selling off one of the great art collections in the world to sheiks in Dubai and oligarchs in Russia.
Right.
But it seemed the only way. So I got up one morning and I just had this idea, and it wasn't just my idea. I mean, I'd heard aspects or variations from different lawyers that I was talking to. And I got up one day. I'm a kind of a compulsive doodler, and made myself a pot of coffee, sat down at the table, and the legal pad was in front of me, except that I had gone through all the pages taking notes. So the only thing that was there was the cardboard backing. So I just doodled this idea that I had, which was to get the state. I drew a circle up to the left, and I put state. And in the middle, I put art. And on the right, I put pension, both in circles. Then I drew arrows from the state with dollar signs to the art, and then arrows from the art to the pensions. And the idea was to get the state to kickstart some funding to save the museum, put the museum into a public trust. Then I drew a square around the art to, in my mind anyway, indicate we were going to lock the art off from all of the other creditors, use the trust to flow any money we could raise through to the pensions to mitigate the losses for the retirees of their pensions. And then I thought, this is a pretty crazy idea. The governor was saying, no bailout for Detroit, and the legislature, which was controlled by the Republicans, both houses, and largely by the Tea Party, were screaming no bailout for Detroit. Mm-hmm. So I knew it was pretty crazy idea, but I had some ideas and I wrote them down under this little doodle. So that was the germ of the idea that I had: bring in outside funding, monetize the art, give all of it to the retirees, get the retirees off the runway, because they were the largest creditor between their health insurance and their pensions. They were the largest single creditor, and I thought if we could get them off the runway, Detroit could then begin to address some of the other creditors' debts. So that was just an idea. It was just an idea, and in fact, I took this cardboard doodle and put it in the stack of stuff that I had. Put it in when I left the next day. Put it in my carry-on bag. Took it back to Detroit. Took it to my office. Took it out. Put it in a pile behind my desk, and forgot about the doodle. Just totally forgot about it. I didn't forget about the idea, but I forgot about it.
Right. Well, but the doodle is no longer in a pile behind your desk, right? The doodle, which in very simple terms outlined this plan that becomes really the framework for how all of this gets resolved over the next couple of years or year or so. Because I love this story too. Where is that cardboard doodle now sitting or now hanging?
It's hanging in the DIA.
It's a great piece of history right now. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's certainly not art, but it is history, I guess. So, the continuation of the Grand Bargain, what became known as the Grand Bargain story, was I wasn't getting anywhere with the governor, and and I ran into a friend of mine who's the president of the community foundation here in Detroit, or greater southeast Michigan anyway, but she's much more than that. She's truly an international player in the philanthropy world, and ran into her at the deli across the street from the courthouse about a month later, and she asked me how things were going, and I said, not so great. My job deals, I've got no revenue, I've got no assets that can be monetized, so not so great. And she said, well, let me know if you can help. And I thought, here's an idea. I said, I've got an idea, Miriam. This was Miriam Nolan. I said, come on over to my chambers sometime this week. I'll tell you about it. So she came over, and I spun out this idea, and I told her I wasn't getting anywhere with the governor, but maybe the foundations could kickstart the funding. And she looked at me like I was crazy, and she asked me how much I knew about foundations. And I said, nothing. I know they have a lot of money for worthwhile causes, and we have a very worthwhile cause, and we need a lot of money. And she said, well, first of all, foundations don't work together. Even in 9/11 and Katrina, they don't work together. They have their own mission silos. And second of all, they don't make grants quickly, even small grants. Sounds like you need a lot of money fast. And I said, yeah. I said, but just can you bring as many people to Detroit? I'll bring my whole mediation team, and we'll tell them the inside story of the bankruptcy, and I'll tell them about this idea I have. And the amazing thing is, she gave me their email addresses. I sent out a letter, and within 18 minutes, I got an email back from Darren Walker, the brand new president of the Ford Foundation, saying he would come to Detroit on November 5th. And by the next morning, I had responses from 13 foundation presidents, all coming. So they came to Detroit on November 5th. I had my whole mediation team. I had 8 mediators, including myself and ultimately 8, and a consultant. And we told the story and made my pitch to ask them to help get started. And then Miriam had a dinner at her house for a few of them, and me, and my right-hand guy, Eugene Dreiker, at her house, and we were about 2 hours late getting there. We had thought the meeting would take about an hour and a half. It took 3.5 hours. And people were excited about the idea. I mean, Darren and Alberto Iberguren from the Knight Foundation and Bill White from the Mott Foundation, they were excited about and wanted to talk about the idea. We talked about a lot of other things. We talked about baseball, and we talked about Churchill. We talked about a lot of things, but it kept coming back to this idea. And so over the next month, I spent a lot of time on the phone with the foundation leaders, and I'm speeding this story up because I know we're running out of time. About a month later, Darren Walker called me. I'd just come back in from the courtroom from a sentencing, and Darren called me and he said, Judge, he said, we are inspired by your idea, and Ford is going to make the largest commitment in its history. I really didn't know what that was. And he said, we're going to commit $125 million. And I was just stunned.
Incredible. Wow.
And
the others did too. I mean, I understand within
2 days,
right? There were
within 2 days I had $291 million of commitments. But they were all conditional upon the state's participation and other stakeholders, Aaron. And so I called Eugene and I said, it's time to go back up and see the governor. And we kept this very close. This was not public at all. I mean, the idea had become public, which I thought was going to deep six the whole idea because I thought the foundations would get cold feet. But we drove up to see the governor a couple days after that, and I had planned this little speech. He asked me how things were going. I said, not so great. We don't have any assets, Rick Snyder, who I know, he worked at my congressional campaign in 1982, so I had known him for a long time. And I said, but we're beginning to get commitments from the foundations. And he said, well, tell me about that. And so I'd started doing a tally sheet, and I opened my portfolio to the tally sheet, and I said, well, Ford Foundation has committed $125 million. And just like that, he said, really? I said, yes. He said, the Kresge Foundation has committed $100 million. He said, really? And, I went on, and he's a CPA, so he was adding the numbers up. I was going to roll him out with a lot of drama and give him the total, but he was already there. He said, so you've got $291 million. I said, yeah. He said, well, how much more do you think you'll get? I said, I think we're going to get to $350 million. And then, I rolled out my speech, which was basically, I said, Rick, I said, putting Detroit into bankruptcy was a courageous decision, and it was absolutely the right decision. It was a decision that all of your predecessors had avoided and kicked down the road. But you can't throw up your hands now and say, not my problem. I said, all of this money is conditional upon the state's participation. And you know as well as I do that these numbers are all going to become public. If we, in this assetless bankruptcy, if we don't take advantage of this, and if the state doesn't commit, we will all be weighed by history in the balance and found wanting. And it just changed just like that. And he looked at me and he said, so what are you asking? And I said, I think the state has to match. I think the state has to come up with at least $150 million. And he's a very smart guy. And he says, we're only going to get one shot at this. It's going to be very difficult. You can't come back and retrade me and say you need more. I said, I know that. He said, the legislature is going to be just impossible, very difficult to persuade. So I said, I know that. And then he looked at me and he said, there are very few dramatic moments in life, but this was one. And he said, do you think it will be enough? That was the big question. If it's not enough to get Detroit out of the bankruptcy, then what's the purpose? It's just more good money after bad. So I looked at Eugene, who looks a little like Yoda, and he was sitting across from me, and he had these big bushy eyebrows, and he had his eyes scrunched together, and he just almost imperceptibly nodded. And I said, Rick, I said, if the state matches the foundations, comes to $350 million, we get $350 from the foundations. We're still going to need probably another $100 million, but we'll make it work.
Yeah.
And with that, he reached across, we shook hands, and that was it. And so I had the state and the foundations that we needed more. The DIA, many of the politicians wanted the DIA to have, as they said, some skin in the game. So I started negotiating with the DIA for a contribution, and that was
This is the Detroit Institute of Art, right?
Yes, and their chairman, Gene Gargaro, was a real hero. The DIA was already strapped and had made a lot of commitments, and he finally pledged $50 million to raise it. And I called the governor and I said, Gene has said that he believes he can commit $50 million, and the governor said, well, not sure that's going to be enough. So he said, but I'm getting an award in Washington for being supportive of the arts. It was a group called the Americans for Art, I think. And he said, I've asked Gene to go with me. He said, I'll talk to him. This was a couple of weeks. So the night before that, and I'd been talking to the governor and to Gene, things hadn't moved at all. So the night before, the governor calls me. I'm sitting at home. It's about 11 o'clock. And the governor calls and says, guess what I've been doing for the last hour and a half? I said, what's that? He said, I've got the DIA's audited financials. He said, I see how we can save them $4 to $6 million a year. I said, really? I said, all right. And then he dove into this accountant speak, which, went right past.
Right.
So I said, well, what are you going to do with that? He said, I'm going to ask Gene for $100 million tomorrow. I said, Rick, get the award first. So
and he got it. And he got it, right? He got the $100 million.
So the next morning, I'm sitting at my desk, and he calls. And his voice was just ebullient. He said, I had a very productive breakfast with Gene Gargaro. I said, okay, how productive? He said, I got you $100 million. So, my first instinct was to call Gene and kind of confirm it, but I decided not to. I wanted to, people have different memories of these kinds of things, so I wanted to kind of beta test it. And Gene called me a little later, and I said, how did your breakfast with the governor go in Washington? He still sounded sort of befuddled, and he said, that was the most expensive breakfast in history.
Well, and Judge, there are more pieces to this. I mean, I know Judge Rosen, the bankruptcy judge, he had to beat up some banks and get them to take a fraction of what they had what they were owed technically, but ultimately
we did a lot of in the mediation sessions. We all did a lot of beating up and getting beaten up. And there were deals. Once the grand bargain got put together, though, deals started coming together. The first deal we got with a financial creditor was a really important deal. We'd been negotiating with them for months, and we ended up going over to my 78-year-old Italian barber's shop with me and the city's lead attorney and the lead guy for the insurance companies on these UTGO bonds. And I got the governor on the phone because the state had a role to play in this. And in 3 hours, with three of us getting our hair cut, and Frankie, my barber, listening, we put the outlines of the UTGO deal together, and it worked. It stuck. And so that was the first municipal creditor deal we got. Then we got the LTGOs, and the media started referring to it as the Grand Bargain Express, because I was it got out to the media that, not by me, but that I was telling the creditors that, a bankruptcy is like a train waiting at a station. The people who buy the first tickets get the best seats. People who buy the next tickets get the next best seats. People who buy the last tickets are on the train. They may not get the best seats, but they're on the train. And then people who don't buy tickets end up in front of the train. And so that became sort of a mantra for me, and also the media began to call it the Grand Bargain Express. And, it just came together.
Great. I think I've used something similar to that in settlement negotiations when I'm trying to persuade one defendant to get on board and get out of the way of I think I called it a runaway train in one case, but that might be a different analogy.
When Judge Rhodes approved the plan of adjustment, the courthouse was full. I had an open house in my chambers. His courtroom down the hall was full. Everybody was there. And people who had been screaming at each other and yelling at each other, and I can't describe the emotions in this during our mediations. We're hugging each other and high-fiving and talking about how great the experience was, and very optimistic about the future for Detroit. Every deal we did had some creativity to it. And when I was going through this, Aaron, it was a series of deals, head down, get to the finish line, do this deal, do this, that deal, do another deal, get what became known as the haircut at the haircut, the deal we did at the barber shop, do that deal. But as I look back on it now with 5 years of perspective, it was really more about people. I call it Detroit's Big Bang Theory of unrelated people and events colliding together in the same space and coming together to save an iconic American city and to overcome distrust and rigidity and self-interest, to come together, find common ground, plant a flag on that common ground, and rescue, as I said, a great city. And in today's politics of dysfunction and polarization and people shouting at each other, you just don't see that.
Well, and we talked about that, and want to finish with this idea, but to get there, also just reflect for a second. When I first moved to Philadelphia in 1990, Ed Rendell was then the mayor, and he went on to become governor of Pennsylvania later. And I remember soon after I moved to Philadelphia, I was at a speech that Rendell gave, and he was looking back on the city's history and some of the economic problems the city was facing at that time. And I'll never forget, it made such a deep imprint in my thinking at the time. I remember then Mayor Rendell saying that in the prior 25 years, so from 1990 going back 25 years, Philadelphia had lost 250,000 manufacturing jobs.
Oh.
And it was staggering because, of course, every one of those is a good paying job that goes to support a family, that goes to support the community and the city, because those wage earners are paying taxes. And I just think about today, now we talk about automation in industry and a lot of structural changes in our economy. And the things that hit Detroit, the pension issue, the changes in the economy locally, financial crises in Wall Street, the impact that has, it just seems like this is not a situation that is unique to Detroit and other cities. You mentioned Chicago. So, and we do live in a very, very difficult political time. So what if you were asked, and I guess I'm asking you, what advice do you have, or what warnings do you have, or what lessons do you think we should be paying attention to from this incredible Detroit experience?
Well, first I ought to put a plug in for a Philadelphia guy, right?
Yeah.
Sam, who a lot of your listeners would know from Philadelphia, is now a documentary filmmaker. I know he ran for mayor of Philadelphia and barely lost. But Sam is making a documentary about the Detroit bankruptcy and the larger context that you're talking about. So I think Detroit is a cautionary tale for every American city, that you cannot continue to pile structural debt upon structural debt. It's the road to oblivion. You have to restructure the basics of the financial underlayment and structure. You just can't keep borrowing. And the other is that you can't keep raising taxes. Many municipalities are trying to tax their way out of their debt. And what will happen is what's happening in Detroit. People will leave because and the tax base will dissolve, and then the services dissolve, and all of a sudden you have a situation where people are paying enormously high taxes, both property taxes and income taxes and sales taxes and all the other fees, and getting less and less for it. People vote with their feet. So that's the cautionary tale part of it. I think the optimistic piece of it is that people really can come together, Aaron. They can overcome distrust. They can overcome self-interest. They can overcome the ghosts of past mistakes. Detroit had certainly made many of them, but people can come together. They can find common ground, and they can save a city.
Judge, what a fascinating story, and such a privilege to have you on Good Law, Bad Law to talk about this. Not only fascinating in and of itself, and the incredible stories from haircuts to doodles and famous art museums, but also what we should all be thinking about in our own cities and communities about what so much there is to learn from this. So, Judge Rosen, thank you so much for being on the program. I can't thank you enough.
Well, thanks, Aaron. I hope maybe you and I get a chance to meet sometime, either in Philadelphia or come to Detroit and see what's happening here.
I would love it. I would love it, and I hope so as well. Thanks again.
Thank you.